Last week, we talked about bipartisanship, the concept of politicians from opposing parties working together to pass legislation. At the end of that video, I asked you to write in the comments a political goal of the opposing party that you would be willing to trade for a political goal of your own. And while I was thinking about how I would answer that question, I realized how important it is to think carefully about the role that you and I play in bipartisanship. I took a look into it, and what I found was fascinating. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If this is your first time here, my name is Gerard LeConte, and I'm here every Sunday morning to dive deep into something that has caught my attention, usually something to do with American politics and government. This week, we're talking about political polarization, that thing that makes you get in arguments with people you went to high school with on Facebook. Political polarization is the process of people coalescing around two opposing political views or ideologies. The tighter they coalesce around each pole, the more polarized a populace is. The further away from each pole more people are, the less polarized a populace is. It's worth noting that political polarization is about political disagreement, not temperamental disagreements. So polarization doesn't necessarily correlate with extremism and radicalism. You can have periods of very high political disagreement, but low extremism, and vice versa. It's also worth noting that political polarization isn't always fueled by the same things. Sometimes it can be based on policy differences, like whether or not same-sex marriage should be legal or what tax rates should be, but other times it can be based on more amorphous things like social standing, power, or demographics. For example, Donald Trump derived political support from the way he treated liberals as much as for his support for any one policy or another. Plenty of supporters couldn't care less what he did from a policy standpoint, so long as he continued to produce liberal tears. It's pretty difficult to determine whether or not political polarization is a bigger problem today than it has been in the past. For starters, political opinions are much better sorted between political parties than they have been in the past. The democratization of information and communication has made it much easier for parties to identify with issue sets that correlate with each other. So as long as each party stays committed to a fairly consistent set of opposing issues, it's much easier for voters to sort into one party or the other. This hasn't always been true. There used to be conservatives and liberals in both of the prominent parties, but then the culture war started, and they subsumed politics. The parties started to not only target voters sympathetic to a particular set of policies, but also to the social and cultural preferences and priorities that tended to correlate with the most engaged voters dedicated to those parties, and vice versa. Blending political, social, and cultural issues in this way made it much more difficult for a voter to break away from the pole with which they identify. One thing is for sure, if polarization isn't worse, it's definitely more dynamic. Politics, lifestyle, and even religion have been sources of polarization for as long as America has been a country, but we've been adding more and more wrinkles over the last century. We're now polarized over media as well. It's increased with each new medium: print, radio, television, internet. Nowadays, your political affiliation is just as likely as anything to predict the TV you watch and websites you visit. In the last 20 years or so, and particularly in the last 10, reality and truth itself has become more polarized. Nothing made this more poignant than when Kellyanne Conway coined the term alternative facts when characterizing what the Trump administration was willing to accept as truth. That came on the heels of the proliferation of fake news, or manufactured stories that are made to look like journalism in order to hurt the political standing of one's opponent. We saw the most recent result of this when hordes of Trump supporters recently stormed the nation's capital because they refused to accept the results of an election. Now, with pretty good accuracy, you can predict the deviations between what two people accept as truth and fact based on their political alignment. So what's the problem with polarization? For starters, it makes it a lot easier for parties to choose their voters. When political affiliation embodies so many different aspects of one's life, it creates a lot of demographic indicators that can be used in the districting process to gerrymander voting districts to artificially inflate or diminish public opinion in geographic areas. For example, Republicans have not made a compelling effort to be on the same side of important issues that resonate with Black voters as those Black voters, particularly voting rights and civil rights. As a result, Black voters are among the most polarized polarized demographics, with 87% of them voting Democrat in the last election. That means if Republicans simply draw districts that split the black vote up into as small a pieces as possible, they can effectively disenfranchise them, and they do. As we discussed in the previous video, polarization also increases partisanship, since it reduces the issues on which a politician can safely cross the aisle without incurring widespread dissent from the politician's voter base. It also means that a politician is more likely to only have real electoral competition in the primaries, which can incentivize a gradual drift to the more intense wing of their party affiliation. But what I find most interesting about the recent shifts in political polarization is the implications it has for how the two political parties can behave and situate themselves. See, the sorting that we talked about earlier has resulted in two dominant political parties that look very different from one another. On one hand, you have a Democratic Party that is racially diverse, relatively unreligious, relatively young, and disproportionately urban. On the other hand, you have a Republican Party that is overwhelmingly white, older, predominantly Christian, and rural. This creates an unavoidable asymmetry in how the parties message to the electorate. Ezra Klein has dedicated a whole book to this topic, and he provides invaluable insights that I encourage you to pursue. Democrats are appealing to a much broader range of people, a wider range of races, ethnicities, religions, and lifestyles. They are also appealing to a larger number of people in total. This isn't reflected in our electoral results because of our minoritarian voting system, but Democrats have won the popular vote in almost every presidential election in the last 30 years, and they usually win more total votes in the House and the Senate. This means, by the demographic nature of the people they're trying to appeal to, Democrats have to consider the concerns of a much broader range of people, which means they can't be as extreme in their political ideology. What does this all really mean? It means that Republicans can double down on a relatively narrow political ideology, one that hyper-focuses on the wants, needs, and fears of old white Americans, while Democrats have to stay somewhat tethered to the ideological center, whatever that really means in this paradigm, or else risk alienating one of the many groups in its broad coalition. And that's basically what we're seeing now. This is why it feels like Republicans live in their own alternative world. It's because in a weird way they kind of do. They live in a world constructed solely around the perspective of the old Christian white American, which explains why the prevailing tenet of today's GOP is white grievance. This is a dangerous place to be because people are prone to act in more extreme and radical ways the further into a corner they're backed, as we saw on January 6th. And the narrow set of media outlets that they rely on have a financial incentive not to show them a way to reintegrate into the rest of the country. Unfortunately, the only way I see out of this is to take away the crutch of minoritarian elections that Republicans rely on. Republicans are able to win elections while ignoring significant swaths of the American population because our elections ignore a significant swath of the American population. Until all votes are counted equally and representation in government is equal, Republicans have a better chance at success by continuing to convince their base that they are under attack than they do admitting that their political opponents are worthy Americans with ideas and lifestyles that have merit. Thanks for watching. I hope that wasn't too depressing. I also hope that I don't sound like a broken record continuing to come to the conclusion that our social and political problems are largely institutional. That being said, if we all understand the aspects of our institutions that are working against us, we have a better shot at improving them. Comment down below and let me know what you think. How does polarization affect your life? I'd really like to know. Hit that like button if you liked the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to help it grow. Also, come check me out on TikTok, where I tell you the daily news every morning and provide daily commentary on current events. We have a lot of fun over there. Have the best week that you can, and I'll see you next Sunday.